Hello! The more I advance in life as a musician, the least I see the differences between interpretation, transposition, transcription, paraphrase, composition, improvisation, decoration, ornamentation, narration. It seems to me like we are given to learn the music of the others, which we retell with our own words, educated to how tell them rightly, accordingly to this and that style, time period, and knowledge of the musical grammar, and also the taste, eventually the instrumental translation, if not on the original ones. And you build up little by little some aesthetic choices, shared or not, sometimes trendy, sometimes not. Some people try to be purposely original, perhaps without a conviction, but also by the desire to be different. This is also fascinating because ultimately we respond to the mirror of our own soul. After all, we could pretend, actors do, but believably, that is the point of their trade. And I find that performers also, in a way, retell by this way, perhaps, becoming co-authors. Not on the legal point of view, obviously. At least in the eyes of, or the ears and the psyche of their listeners. Very often the performer, being the only person alive on stage compared to most of the authors who are dead, becomes the incarnation of the artwork, which is spiritually uplifting, emotionally draining, possibly psychologically disturbing, but in any aspect of the word, most likely calling for introspection, reflection, everything but entertainment. In other words, forget yourself rather than think about yourself, and through yourself the humanity in you, and through the humanity in you the type of meaning we put into it, of course, religiously for those who do believe, or not for those who don't. But there is a sense of finitude, a sense of I extract the best of human experience in this author's novel, or if not the best, something essential from human lives experience in this theater play that mirrors my psyche, my soul, my search, my weakness, my sins, my shortcomings. But artistically, or therefore retold artificially, in fact, it talks to us naturally. Of course, it's very difficult to accept for one's self-esteem to be made fun of one's own shortcomings. Nobody is happy to be laughed on their behalf or made fun of themselves, let less of their own shortcomings. So it seems to me like the true art form is a revelation, like a mirror that reflects, revealing to us who we really are. While the action, the intensity of the making, of the trade, of the energy, of the industry of producing the art form is the hope, is an idea. Perhaps it becomes obsessive, like an ideology, a point to prove, a point to make, to inform, but also in a way to educate through the music that you produce, with lyrics, without lyrics, perhaps using psychological manipulation of the psyche of the listener by delaying harmonically, organizing melodically the ways that you suggest, you hint, you do what essentially our inner world, and everybody's is a different one, obviously, tells ourselves, like our inner, what we call our soul, but perhaps it's our essence, or something that guides us, or something that entices us, or something that holds us back from, something that we fear to go into because we're afraid of. We're afraid of committing, we're afraid of developing it, we're afraid of hoping it. Sometimes we indulge in what we fear we shouldn't, because it's somehow a vertigo that brings us to that. It's the human experience, the temptation, the expectation, the pleasure, the hope, the enjoyment, perhaps all in a package of hope. Sometimes hope is the only thing left after everything else is lost. Perhaps illusions, promises, ideas, and perhaps there is a purpose for these things not to have happened in one's individual's life, but when we transform our beings for the time of a artwork, performance, or creation, or recreation in that sense, perhaps the composer, the transcriber, the improviser, melt, blend, fuse, it's a fusion of all these. The question is, does the establishment of music education through publications, musicologists and teachers limit young people's intuitive outburst to recreate what they received? After all, like famous texts for actors, same thing with famous music scores for young artists who through the text of the others discover themselves, and some resonate more with oneself than others, and perhaps at different points of their lives. That is true for everything. Mother tongue comes first by ear, then you read and learn how to write, and eventually write something new with those words: novel, poem, story, article. But then you acquire foreign languages that allow you to read or watch or understand something that is conceived in another language that brings in its own culture, for which without the language, of course you can have a translation for the meaning, but you wouldn't get the innuendos. And therefore the secondary thoughts, which in fact enrich the understanding of the main, it's not just telling a story, is how. And in that how, that's the style, that what mesmerizes the listener. That's like taste for chocolate, for a sauce, for a music, for an actor, for a film. The acquired taste for things that we like in life, and that we could, of course, disagree to say, oh, I was silly to have liked that film when I should have liked this, or that is what I think about the trends, but that's fine because life is an experience, and on the hand of experience, you have education, and then after that, you have wisdom, and after that, you have throughout experience. And supposed to all this work out somehow together to produce at some point some bright instant, some kind of um, spark of truth where all the elements just blend rightly, harmoniously, almost besides one's own will or just without one's forcing them. They just sort of settle in. It's like politeness that you receive from your parents that becomes natural when you become adult. And it's not just an added layer to your personality, but it becomes your personality. Of course, most people think determinists rather, sorry, that you're genetically basically codified at birth to be this or that in terms of character or destiny. Of course, we have our free will, le libre arbitre in French, I think it is the free will, which to a certain extent we believe might escape us when we're not very sure if we have this magnetic attraction that we don't know how to define, when we feel intuitively that this is the right person to love, or hopefully to be loved by if reciprocated, which is rare, and then make a story out of it to convince ourselves, because we don't know, but we cannot explain, but we really feel. And to feel is not, of course, it's separate from the thinking process, which should be separate from the feeling process, because in a way it could clog it, and it does. In my case, very often, I must confess, without indulging. But everybody is differently built in their, I would say, percentage of how they manage all these perceptions of their past, distant one, where they come from, or they think they do, or where they think they go, and the sense of making sense of the nonsense of all of that, while at the same time is charming and marvelous, and a sun ray on the cheek, a kiss from somebody loved, a child that smiles at you, or somebody who trusts you and you don't want to betray, and then sometimes you don't know how to deal with it. And I think in a way all these human experiences are nothing to do in a way with music, except that I find that music is the art form that, avoiding the language, which is the human's capacity to communicate, tool to imagine concepts, and therefore imagine their own finitude, and realizing it, not be disappointed. And if you're too aware or too lucid about it, it becomes crude, and you start becoming nihilist, or perhaps one becomes hopeless. Between hopeful and hopeless, sometimes there is a very thin layer, if not in an invisible wall. And I find that music is not like a soundtrack of life. It's kind of a cliche word. I like it, but I don't believe it. Though at the same time, I find that for a musician, it's a helpful thing. It sort of plays inside your head like a recurrent old thought that you don't know where it came from, but you cannot chase it. And it's like a dream that you almost remember, but perhaps partially, and in a way it intrigues you because it comes back to connect with some of realities of the day that happens after you dreamed it, because it was so real, of course, in the dream. So are we really alive in our dreams, or really sleeping in our lives? It's a common cliche as well, but it's, I think, daydreaming. Therefore, that's why I make the analogy with music making, is so connected to music making. It's not just restating Well, it is obviously when you make an interpretation, because it's somebody else's thoughts, words, intended um, expressions. The problem very often, because we know it with words, is that their languages evolve and some die, obviously. But the point is that somehow music without lyrics, which for most people is awkward because it's always associated to songs, um, unless the song is so famous that it becomes even recognized by its melodic trend without the words when played instrumental. But let's say most of the song's purpose is to vehicle some kind of lyric that therefore expresses some kind of meaning, that in fact is some kind of a burst or expression or revenge or explosive desire to, in other words, to express one's own inner world, or a reflection of what one refuses to accept from the world as it is. Then you have a protest song, and then you have a protest music, or you have a love music that is consensual and you try to bring everybody to like it, or therefore to like you. But in ways between liking or disliking, which is also very superficial in my view, and I shouldn't have gone that way. I wanted to say in my thoughts that I'm sharing with you that I think music expresses what it's not wordable or it's not explainable, which is why it is. So what does an appoggiatura mean in major compared to in minor? Well, obviously differently. Smile with a tear, sadness, happiness at the very basic level, but then it gets more subtle. When you overlap and you hold it, it becomes a suspension. So all of a sudden you hear the new harmony instead of clearly as you expect. It's not just a delayed response of one of the notes, which it is mostly the illusion that for an instant you have another harmony. Could have been, but didn't. In other words, the innuendos in music bring us through the interpretation of what we perceive the composer's idea was to hint. Oh, I don't have enough vocabulary to express it subtly enough as music does. Perhaps there isn't enough words for that, which is why therefore there are music notes. But now that I'm embarked, I have to, in explaining, I'll try to just say that I find it unbelievably touching and moving human experience to share music with a chamber partner, with an audience partner, with a recording engineer partner, with a teacher partner, with a student. We are all companions in music making. So we learn the craft, we learn the rules, we learn the how it's done, we analyze in order to understand, perhaps to imitate, for sure to copy, and then perhaps make a variation on it, like jazz musicians do on a given tune. And after all, isn't in a certain way all of music making a variation on a theme? Like, aren't all human told storytellings a variation on the human experience of love, hope, death, life? Same, from different sides of the coin. So we are in a sort of a perpetual theme and variations every day, every evening, every month, every year, every generation, and we reject, we restart, we think, we hope, we try to do better, we are appalled by things, and we are enthused by things, and sometimes it appears that music making is vain compared to the sufferance of the world, geostrategically, social, economically. It is true, all this is absolutely, in a way, gratuitous, frivolous, artificially unimportant. If I play the mordant on the downbeat or in the upbeat, before or between the beat, in this or that tradition of this or that Baroque music style, and compared to what is happening with famine and what is happening with unfairness and slavery and racism and people hating each other or wanting to own each other one way or the other, countries owning each other, or it's always about ruling and organizing people's lives and thoughts and hopes. So ideology at every level. And all the isms of the 20th century ended up in so many wars and so much hopes that were shattered, regardless of the validity of their ideologies or how they were implemented by humans. Because in a way we all search for something. And music is such an universal vehicle because in a way it's not incarnated always in words. Of course it can. In a way it's almost tethered with the words to a meaning. When the words are just sounds, they become poetic. When you listen to a foreign language you don't understand, the purpose of the words, that is the meaning, disappears and you hear just the sounds of it. I guess that's what poetry or daydreaming is about. Sort of like, in a way, the dream, the reality, or the imagination, or is it the subconsciousness subconscious in us that tell us what is the reality? Perhaps the artists who create works that are meaningful to us are those who are able to bring both together, the fusion of the imagination and the reality, in a way that we don't know which is which and we don't want to know. Perhaps we want to attribute the one to the other and vice versa, according to how it fits our fear of finitude. And we want to prolong it. Perhaps we want to, I don't believe very much in this, but perhaps some of the great that we consider so, but most forgotten one also exist around them. Creators probably sort of pass the hand and saying, go on forward with this and do your own. I often think if somebody asked Beethoven what would people play in 20, for instance, and he might have said, well, they'll play the Beethoven of the day. I would assume that he would have said, but perhaps he would have said, they'll play me. After all, why not? That is relevant beyond the time periods, that is relevant outside of the time capsule in which we live for as long as it's given to us to live. And that is relevant beyond the time capsule. While we live in our day, then we live in daydream, even with Shakespeare, Molière, or Bach and Couperin, or with contemporaries, regardless if we understand them or like them or dislike them. In a way, the accumulation of knowledge of the past is so heavier on today's young people who are into discovering the meaning for life for themselves in terms of artistic studies or possibly music studies. I, of course, always focus down to the music and the piano. I always see in front of my own funnel. But nevertheless, I still think that the creators or the, let's say, great music composers of the past knew less of their past than we know of our past in terms of knowledge, capacity of, curiosity of, organized systems of, through libraries in original ways, then academies and schools and conservatories where we conserve the traditions. And then, of course, the marvelous situation of being able to access directly, even without to go through the book, the document through the internet. And so who knows, if having had so much access to the past, he wouldn't have impeached some of the creativity of some of the musicians of the past. Of course, hungry as they were, most of them, they had to just survive. So Haydn wrote plethora of pieces, Vivaldi wrote plethora of pieces. I doubt that they had any time to rethink the system or the tonal system or the post-tonal system. I don't say that it's unnecessary and impossible to do even when you're in survival mode, but it's harder. You keep reacting rather than thinking ahead, and to organize a new music system, to organize a new musical universe with a new organization of the tones, takes time to think. Or perhaps for these who took it is because they were so uneasy with what they received in the tradition or whatever was taught to them. And those innovators are to be saluted, because I think they are groundbreakers, and for more than the music itself that they produced, regardless if one likes it or not, one is admirative of their human experience to question the status quo and entirely rebuild something out of the after breaking it. It's very difficult to accept, understand. Perhaps it's makes people passionately connect to it, or some people passionately disconnect from it, to say the least. But it doesn't matter. Then you have these others who just happen to go through music different time periods, and they receive something from their ancestors inevitably, because they arrive and they hear music written before them, and they just go with the flow and just add their they add their genius, their stamp, their personality, their unbelievable, unforgettable fragrance. And we just go, oh, Mozart, in French pronounced. That's terrible. Mozart. Ah, Schubert. Ah. And I think that we need to acknowledge that not all artists or all creators are revolutionaries, and some are just continuators, and they're equally meaningful. Of course, perhaps in classifications and in organizations, in music teaching theory books, they have different categories. But I believe that, in fact, it's all about human expression, human experience, human angst, and human hope. That's why when I play music of others, as most of us do, when they do, I think we have a sense of appropriation. So do we really make interpretations, translations, or do we make improvisations, in which case we take too much liberty according to the scores that are published, but then in fact, ultimately, what is given to us to express ourselves within the greatness of the music that we serve is not only to recite it while we do, it's not only to revere it and therefore not change it or add to it or retract to it, but I think there is inevitably something we do that is us, and we leave that little mark. Perhaps it's not humble to say that, but I believe that it makes the interpretation of a Lipati, a waltz by Chopin, more meaningful to me than the Chopin waltz itself, which should be by itself the case, to say, well, it's the work first and the composer naturally for the music, and then the performer. But I think that music is to be brought alive, mis or understood, or both, according to the tastes and the judgments, but transmit it and just becoming for a very brief instant, the performer becomes the work. Keeping humble, but let it invade your, like a high tide in your soul, and you go and you feel so full of it that by exhaling you, it's an analogy obviously that came just to the point now, but yeah, share it with the people. And perhaps in that exchange of humanity is more meaningful than only the exchange of the knowledge, the trade, the impressive ways of doing it, which is great. I mean, not everybody is Liszt. It's marvelous when you are, for those who can, but that's okay. There are many levels to accept music and to receive it and to transmit it as well, to share it. But ultimately, I think, is this kind of food for soul. I thank you very much.